This is the second video on the IELTS Task 1 writing, and today we will look at what to do during your 20 minutes. The process can be summarized like this. First, read the prompt. Understand the chart, diagram, map, or table. Take a few minutes to decide how you're going to organize your response. Write your introduction by paraphrasing the language used in the prompt. When this is finished, write 2 to 3 paragraphs addressing the requirements of the prompt. We'll look at some examples of data description later when we look at different types of charts. Now, the first step is to properly read the prompt. Let's look at what the prompt is. The prompt is the instructions given to you in the little box. You will notice the last line is always the same. And of course, so is the word limit. The second step is to understand exactly what's being described. But in order to respond to the prompt, it's necessary to understand the data that's being depicted visually. In the previous illustrations, we saw a diagram where a heating system is described. Here we have a table, but exactly what is being described? It's a comparison of the weekly rent for various size properties with the yearly salaries necessary for these properties. So the data being described is rent versus salaries. Thirdly, write your introduction. This is done by paraphrasing the information from the prompt. Now, one way of paraphrasing is to use derivatives of words. So in this example, the verb contributed is changed to a noun, contribution. Another method you could use is to change the sentence into the passive, which is used a lot when we're describing a process, such as when you're faced with a diagram. And of course, you can use synonyms, such as in the example, using purchase for bought. Although in this example, the sentence remains largely the same as the one in the prompt, so it might be a good idea to change it even further. Now, when writing, it's important to use the right tenses at the right time. In this example, we will use 2 tenses. First, when we talk about what the table represents, we'll use the present tense, such as the table shows. However, when we start talking about the data, the past tense will be used. For example, fewer than half of the enrolled students were female in 1928. However, with diagrams that show how a process works, our approach will be different. Since processes don't happen only in the past, the present tense will be used throughout our response. Next comes the really important part, understanding what the data is describing. The x-axis gives us the time, and how about the y-axis? The data represented on the y-axis will always be expressed as a noun. So in this first line chart, the data is describing the tonnage of goods transported by various means. That is why in the sample answer, we see phrases such as the quantities of goods and the amount of goods. Now here is the second example, but what is represented on the y-axis? The chart doesn't give us a unit. It might be logical to assume that the units are millions, and that in the sample answer they use millions as well. But in my opinion, it can be a dangerous assumption to make. In this example, real-life knowledge leads us to believe that the units are millions, but it's not always so simple to see. So I would suggest that where the unit is not specifically mentioned, we use the term unit instead of trying to guess what the unit is. The third example shows a map. From the prompt, we can see the term to be used in our description is site. And when describing the 2 sites, we see that terms such as area, location, zone, etc. are used. You will notice that throughout the response, the present tense is used. The last example is a diagram. Now here, we need to get a lot of our information from the illustrations. such as, for example, what powers the taxi. The title alone does not give us that much information to work with. Now, the language used in the prompt is the standard language that is always used. But obviously, we're not comparing anything here. Next is deciding how our response is going to be organized. In our first example, the first paragraph is used to describe the most significant features, the highest and the lowest figures, and also the figures showing the highest growth, road, pipeline, and water. The second paragraph is devoted to the remainder of the main features, as represented in the graph. Rail. Remember, all the main features need to be addressed in order to get a high score for the task achievement criteria. The last paragraph gives a conclusion, which is not really necessary for the task 1. However, if time allows, you can include some final thoughts, provided they're not just your opinion and not just a repetition of what you've said before. In this example, there is a conclusion, which merely repeats what has been said earlier. This, together with the fact that there's an overview, makes the conclusion unnecessary.